Well, welcome back, friends. I am so thrilled about being able to have this conversation for anybody who's familiar with the Zeitcast or with me, because I have been an evangelist for Chris Green, a John the Baptist, if you will, for Chris Green for a long time. So he doesn't need an introduction for many of you. He is, of course, he is Dr. Chris Green as of just a few months ago, and I got to be there for this really beautiful, really wonderful consecration service. He is Bishop Chris Green. Where he comes from, he's still brother. He's Brother
That's right.
Green. And to the devil, he is known as public enemy number one.
Oh my gosh, man. I remember a revival service I preached, after which this man stood up and said, after a sermon like that, I expect to be driving home and see the devil in a phone booth dialing 911. I mean, yeah. What do you say to that? Like, yeah,
What do
you
you
probably
say?
will.
Right, what do you
You
say?
probably will.
That's so great. Well, Chris has been, we've been together through thick and thin in all kinds of ways. But the most recent way that Chris has saved my life is that in this um, sort of emergency Advent book, that this wild project that was kind of burning a hole in me. And I'm telling you, Chris, I thought about this for days. I'd mentioned it to Nicole several times. It's like I really feel like this little book needs a Chris Green forward. It just felt like that would be intimate in our friendship and just who you are and how you think theologically. I thought it'd be so great, but um, I was literally embarrassed to ask anybody anything about this book coming out in like 50 seconds. So you texted me about something else. And so I took it as like sort of a mystical prodding, like, oh, well, I could see if Chris would be interested in checking out the Advent book. And then I just sort of slid in there, like, if you felt like writing a foreword.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
which of course you so generously churned out this beautiful forward in like in like 24 hours. But part of what was so wonderful about this experience, I thought would be a great place to start. As I was writing this, I don't think I was fully aware of just how much this little project really is about Sister Margaret Gaines until
Mm-hmm.
you read it and you saw that. And so I
Yeah.
thought, and of course, what made it into the final product is considerably different at this point, because it almost felt like, sort of like the twist at the end of a film or something. Yeah, okay, this project has been really about Sister Margaret all along. So I thought that might just be a good place to dive in terms of, even from from an earlier version of the manuscript,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
why that's where you went.
Yeah. When what I read, the version that I read, which is, is a skeleton compared to what it is now, I think
Mm.
the it was still, even in that state, clear to me that this was, and I think I sent this text to you, something along the lines of, her intercession is driving this,
Mm.
and her intercession for what's playing out in the world right now, what's playing out
Mm.
in the Middle East, what's playing out in Gaza and the West Bank and elsewhere, and that sense of who she was and is as a person, and knowing her relationship to you. You had said to me early on, you had a sense of urgency about the book,
Mm-hmm.
that there was a kind of a fire moving you, and it seemed obvious to me, like reading it. Oh, this is why. Like, this is
Mm.
something that the saints are interceding about. So of course, those of us who are close to some of them in one way or another, because of the way our lives have been led, are going to be moved
Mm.
to speak up about it. So I think that seemed really obvious to me. And you had, I think at that point it was in chapter 4. I can't
Yeah.
remember exactly. And then at the end of the book again, you were talking about her. So she showed up. It's not like you hadn't mentioned her or engaged her, but it seemed clear to me, no, this is in many ways her book. I mean, it's you
Mm.
speaking on her behalf. And our conversation kind of went from there. And then when you
Mm.
started showing me where that was taking you, that it seemed pretty obviously right to me. That's what this book is. And I think, what had hit me is how fitting it is that a work like this follows. It's a part of her legacy. It's a part,
Yeah.
When we're comfortable talking in those terms, those of us who've been raised and we're leery about talking about the intercession of the saints,
Sure.
we don't hesitate to talk about the legacy of our mothers and fathers in the faith. But of course, I think those things are one, right?
Yeah.
That the life that she lived and the prayer that she's become are one. And her influence on you personally before she died is now been brought up into the spirit. And so of course that's going to create urgency in you when you see what's happening to her people in her place.
Yeah.
How could it not, right? That's your mother, and those are
Yeah.
your people because they're her people.
Yes. Yes.
And that, I think, is at least some of what I was sensing as I read.
Well, of course I started crying when you sent that, because for whatever other things, I don't know what to think about a lot, but I know I take very seriously that communion of the saints, and that landed in such a deep place with me, this idea of this being a product of her intercession. I think the other reason that felt like it really unlocked something in me was, and I feel like I keep reintroducing Margaret all the time, but if anybody's not familiar, my spiritual grandmother, as I call her, died in 2017. But the person who most influenced my life with God, this Pentecostal woman who became a missionary to Abud Village in the occupied West Bank, just remarkable person. But Chris, the thing that also just so just kind of wrecked me about that, I felt like the last couple of months I've struggled for words, as I know a lot of us have. And in my role as director of the Center for Spiritual Life at DePaul, I'm walking with students, Jewish students, Muslim students. So that's kind of has its own pastoral weight, but feeling like there's something I should say, something I'd want to say. But Chris, I know this is something that you'll identify with, because as wonderful as a creative thinker as you are theologically, I see you do this all the time in terms of finding yourself, or finding where we are on a map through the voices of various saints and theologians. It's almost like I still don't feel like I found words for any of that, but it's almost like Margaret is what I would want to say, like her life is what I'd want to say, or
Yes.
all I know to say.
Yeah, I mean, so many. Yeah, absolutely. I think one is to kind of recognize it's not ours to say directly. I mean,
Yeah.
I got, as you do. I mean, I get, a reasonable or unreasonable amount of pressure to respond to anything that becomes part of the discourse. Right? I'm expected to, by this group or that, to have a response to it. And one of the things I said early on is, I mean, there's some things that I don't have the moral authority to speak to directly. They're not mine to speak to. And of course I have opinions about them. The most important thing is that I'm praying about them, and that I'm listening to people who do have the moral authority.
Yeah.
So what I tried to do is make sure that my ears are open, that I'm crying out in prayer, but I'm listening to people. And I think some of what's happening in this book is you are directing attention to someone who has all the moral authority in the world to talk about these things, right? Rather than you weighing in with, Jonathan Martin's take on what's playing out in the world. It's no, this woman lived it. Her life was at stake for years with these people. Like, this is her language in every sense of the word. This is her world. And so I think the wisdom of that's wisdom. I also think attending to the God she knew so well, and the way of life that she learned to follow, and that sense of the appropriateness of, again, of course, you and I and everyone else listening to this, we have our own opinions about what's playing out socially and politically, what should and shouldn't happen. And some of that should be plain to us. So I'm not simply saying it's a matter of opinion. There are some things that should be obvious to us, evils that we should call evil, and demand justice be done. But at the end of the day, like, our emphasis has to be, as people who are called, our emphasis has to be on who are the people, the prophetic people who are actually given words to say,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we attend to them and to the God they're witnessing to, rather than just, again, throwing out our thoughts, our condemnations or affirmations or whatever they might be. And I feel like this book does that beautifully. She, as you said, like she is a full-bodied, whole person response. And we need to know her story, know what she lived for, and the God who made her life possible. Right? The vision of the life that she had was born out of what she knew about the Lord. And
Yeah.
your book is testifying to her and to the Lord she knew.
That was a powerful thing you said to me that also, as you know, made it in the in the final version of the book, um, was what you said about, well, even like kind of Mark's gospel really being Peter's gospel, and this, this idea that kind of a similar spirit. This is Sister Margaret's book. You're just testifying. That felt really right. And Chris, even when two things that are not directly connected in the book, but are kind of lighting up for me now, the way I never know, for those of us who believe in these sources of authority, I don't know how to work out the math in terms of scripture, tradition, reason, whatever. But I know the hook for me for years now. All I know, I keep talking about it. This idea of that there is a sound of God, and you know that sound when you hear it, and you know that which is not that sound. And I think I'm just aware on the other side of this that when I describe early on the unique cocktail that is Margaret Gaines, they're being the most tender person I've ever been around, like a tenderness that's kind of shattering, like almost on an uncomfortable level. I mean, I don't know if I've ever been around her or not. I tell these things, other people think I might just go around crying all the time. I really don't, but in her presence, I mean, I'd feel that broken open like every time, just unbearably tender, but also a fierceness to her
Yeah.
and all of that just kind of swirling together. And it's interesting that when I do think about the sound of God, and I do think there is a sound, and I do trust that sound more than what anybody else is going to say about the sound, that sound very much is Margaret's sound. That the sound of her, that she very much is to me what God sounds like.
Yeah, and that she's resonating right with that sound, and to be with her is to kind of have that sound resonate in you. Yeah, absolutely right. I think this is what the presence of holy people does to us, right? It brings us back into hearing of the holiness of God. So yeah, I think that seems exactly right to me, and I think it's that sense of tenderness that's not at all a kind of fainting before the brokenness of the world. Like there was something incredibly bold, daring in her, fierce, as you said, and powerful. But it was it was absolutely meek and playful, sweet.
Yes.
And yet again, but not in any way that's sentimental or kind of cheap, or there was nothing false about that sweetness, nothing saccharine about that sweetness. And that is another mark, I think, that of it's not the only mark of the saints. I don't think all the saints sound and feel alike. In fact, I think each one of them has a distinct voice, right?
Yes.
In the way that Paul doesn't sound like Luke and Luke doesn't sound like Isaiah. But there is a sense in which their lives can't help but bear witness to the truth they've come up against.
Yeah.
And Margaret's life absolutely had that. And this book is a testament to that, even if it's in your voice, it's your voice talking about what it was like to hear her hear the Lord.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about just about that dynamic, and the beauty of me hearing her in your voice talking about the Lord, like that, the ways in which that draws me to you and us to her, and in her to the Lord, and what the Lord is doing now for all of his people, including people on both sides of the lines around Gaza. That seems right to me. That seems with whatever I don't understand, I do absolutely believe that's the way that God works, right?
Yeah, yeah. Chris, I love what you said. That feels so right to me, the sense that I know the saints all speak in a singular way. There's particularity to their voices to a point, and yet one of the other things, because I'll never forget that. Honestly, these handful of texts within a couple of days were so electrifying. But I feel like that's happened to us a lot of times about things. Like if we just getting in a room, having a conversation. This case, it was text where something that's like, what? I'm kind of like, what's happening right now? There's such an electricity. But I wrote that little chapter, God kicked inside her, about Mary, and literally about
Mm-hmm.
Jesus kicking in the womb of Mary. At that point, you had already written this gorgeous little foreword where you talk about Eddie Hilsum, and I did not know, or I didn't remember if I'd heard this. Um, what you sent to me then, because I described Margaret as like, Margaret was the kind of person that it felt like God kicked inside of. That literally was part
Absolutely.
of her experience. I mean, that's just stunning to me. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, it's one of the. I mean, I'm getting chills now thinking about it. That exchange between us, and then the ways in which that connects again to Eddie Hillesum's story, and what she's experiencing again in the darkest place imaginable for us. I mean, in Auschwitz, right? I mean, in a concentration camp, she's sensing that kicking in her womb, right? She knows God's alive there, and this shows up in her diaries in a couple of places, and in some of her letters as well, that she is aware, right here in the midst of all this. She's in one of the sections. I think I sent this to you. I think this is actually in the foreword where she says, you cannot help us now.
Mm.
Like, in other words, you're not going to swoop in and rescue us from the ramifications of what is happening here, but we can help you. And what we have to do is guard your place in us to the last. And that place of God in her, that baby in the womb, that's what she's talking about in that passage. Waking up in the middle of the night, listening to the people around her, the other women and girls in the beds around her, listening to them snore and mutter, and realizing, this is God in me. There's an infinite tenderness. That's what she says. An infinite tenderness that comes up in me. And that's it. It's tenderness, but it's an infinite tenderness, right? It's not just a sentimental kind of momentary compassion in which something moves you and then you move on.
Yeah.
Like, an infinite tenderness moves me. And that is where the saints are, right? That kind of holiness doesn't happen unless it happens in the midst of those who are seemingly God forsaken. And again, that's what Margaret's life tells us, right? I mean, she made her home amongst people that many of the people in Margaret's world and in our world don't consider they should have a home.
Sure.
That we've let our politics dictate how we feel and what we think of these human beings, and so much that something like home could be taken away and us not be moved by it.
Yeah.
Right. And she made her home right there.
Yeah. Chris, when you talk about how many of us are not moved by that, are not able to see the world that way, I think that's one of the things that's haunted me about when you talk about Eddie Hilsum, and when I think about Margaret's experience, because Margaret never had. That's the strange thing to me about saints too, is that there's such power in them, but they're not powerful. I mean, she never had influence. She never had reach. I remember her more than once talking about the little book that she wrote in 2010, Small Enough to Stop the Violence, how she'd never had a prophetic experience like that. I feel like something just sort of carried her away. But then, broadly speaking, it's not a book that people have read, and not like this, like, well, the world's just so dumb. I mean, one of the things I found myself grappling with as I was writing is a sense of not only how sad I am that more people haven't felt her influence and heard her voice in that way, but I did hear her voice, but don't always remember or don't act like I did. And just there's just something for me there about that God-forsakenness and that the marginalization of these saints, even if they're very central to us, that these are not people who are pulling levers culturally somehow.
Yeah, that's absolutely. I love that. There's a powerlessness, a weakness. What comes to mind is that passage in Corinthians where Paul talks about, God has formed the body so that there are members that are prominent, members that are honorable, and then there's those members that are hidden and the members that are dishonorable. And I think Margaret is one of those. I mean, she's an internal organ, right? She's hidden from view. She's not the eye. She's not the voice. She's not the bearing that is going to be noticed and seen by everyone. I mean, she's a life sustaining organ hidden away, but we can't imagine the kind of vitality she affords us. Right. And again, this goes back to where she made her home, right? She's at home in places where people, women and girls especially, don't have what should be theirs.
Yeah.
Right. And I remember once hearing her talk about, and I'm sure you remember this too, her talking about recognizing the moment she recognized when she was a young girl and still before she had even gone as a missionary, before she had left as a missionary, having this realization that she was a day laborer in her own life, not the architect of her. Right. And I think some of what she was recognizing then is that not only was she not going to have, she wasn't the architect of a church or a movement or a people. She wasn't even the architect of her own life.
Yeah.
And she was at peace with that.
Yeah.
She was at peace with that. And that's where the holiness emanated from. That recognition, just unbelievable humility and openness to what God can do with that smallness. It's not an accident, right? That's the singular line she's left with us, right? Will someone be small enough to stop the violence? And I think I said to you in our conversations about the book, I mean, now she is small enough. I mean, that she's passed through death into the life of God. She is small enough. And this seems fitting to me that this is a way that her work would come to bear. That she doesn't need to be known. Like the last thing she needs is to be known. What she cares about is that justice is done for these children.
Yes. Yes.
And of course, they're all children. Some of them have aged more than others, but she's Mother Margaret, right? And that's another aspect of this that I don't know if we even want to get into this just now, but I think Kimberly and Alexander and I have talked a lot about this, that one thing our movement in particular, and here I'm talking about Pentecostal charismatic movement globally, is that again and again and again, God has given us mothers like Mother Margaret that we haven't honored as mothers. And there's a kind of presumption on the way that they are caring. And I don't know that I will say it like this. We do not honor mothering in the right ways. And some of that is because, I mean, we could get into this would be a long conversation about why that is, but I don't want to forget, right? That she's a mother, right? And her authority comes from that kind of care. I mean, where the motherhood of God is happening in the way that she is caring for others, including you. Like it's not that's that tenderness extended to you as well. I mean, she's bringing you under her wing.
Yes. Yes. Well, since you can't talk about Advent without talking about Mary, and then it feels like, you had that wonderful line about how from, this, Margaret as a daughter of Mary who lived in the places where Mary lived. And lived as she lived, and how much that idea is so coming to life for me right now. I love, Chris, what you said. Well, everything. I mean, this notion of not knowing how to honor the authority of our mothers and honoring, as mothers. But I'm struck too, Chris, by when you were talking about the Margaret's humility, because it was, and a lot of this language would, I'm sure, make people uncomfortable. Whenever Margaret talked about her life, she would talk about being, giving herself to be trampled up and snuffed out and ephemeral. All the language is very this is very much she saw herself as like, I have yielded my life, and so you've got like this radical surrender.
Yes.
And yet one of the things that, because I don't really know where this came from, but in writing that just felt somehow important to say, because I think we're right to name Mary's story as a story of radical surrender and a path of radical surrender. But especially in a time where, and I mean, we could talk about this, is another thing we could talk about for a whole nother podcast. Maybe the two of us wouldn't change anybody's minds who think this way already, but for people who have some idea that there's this eschatological script, this end time script, and everything that's happening in the Middle East right now is because I've heard so many pastors say some version of like, well, oh, hey, it's not like I don't have a heart. I hate to see these images too, but this is what has to happen because it's in the script.
Right. Yeah.
This is what.
Let's say something about that.
Please,
we're not going to change anybody.
No, jump in. Go.
Let's say this. I mean, there are endless problems with that. But one of the things that you point to this in the book. I mean, part of what makes the saints and the prophets is that they refuse to play by the script.
Yes.
So even if there were scripts, and of course, I'm going to immediately come back and say, of course there isn't. I mean, right. God doesn't play by scripts. Like that's not who our God is. I mean, he's a living God. He's not a play, but he's not a paint by numbers God.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the notion of an eschatological script or that has to happen is an offense to God. I mean, God is not hemmed in by his own decisions, right? And God is not handcuffed. His purposes are not limited to only a couple of possible ways forward. So it's never true of God. I mean, I just talked about this last night. With God, all things are possible. That's what Elizabeth recognizes when Mary comes through the door and greets her, and John kicks in Elizabeth's womb, and Elizabeth is filled with the Spirit. What comes out of her mouth is not just a blessing over Mary, but is a blessing of God as the one for whom all things are possible.
Yes.
All things are possible with this God. So don't come at me with, it has to play out this way, right? No, with God, all things are possible. So do not bring that at me, right? But even if it were true that this had to be, what would mark out Abraham and Moses and David and Paul and Margaret and everyone else who's worthy of the name saint or prophet is they're going to fight. They're going to resist that script for the sake of the people who in that script are the oppressed, the left out, the trampled down. And I think that's how we have to hear Margaret when she's talking about what's happening to her life.
Yes.
She's suffering what the people she's called to love suffer. And she's not going to be, she's not charitable. She's not living a privileged life and then reaching down to help people who are trampled. She's underfoot too.
Yeah.
And there's a way of knowing God in which you experience that in the way that only God makes it experienceable. And that isn't some kind of violence. It isn't subjugation. It isn't God dominating, but it is an experience of God that makes it so that you can be at peace when you are with those who are being trampled and are being trampled as they are. And that's what I think Margaret is naming. It's also what I think Eddie Hillesum is naming. You know, that passage that you mentioned before, she talked about how as a young woman, I mean, she was young when she died, but an even younger woman, that her kind of first encounter with God, which she goes to her knees kind of against her own will, and she becomes a kneeler in training. I mean, this sense of, and I don't know how we find this, and I know this is difficult to talk about well, and I certainly don't pretend to be able to do it. There is a kind of subjugation and a kind of submission and yieldedness that has to do with power, has to do with control, has to do with, in almost every case that we know, with male-centered control, with
Yeah.
patriarchal control, and we in no way want to affirm that for
Sure.
anyone, right? I mean, that is not good. It one of the reasons it's not good, though, is that it is a parody, a mockery
Mm.
of a kind of submission that is good,
Yeah.
a kind of yieldedness that is good, and the tenderness that Margaret had, and now has, the infinite tenderness that Eddie Hillesum sensed in that
Mhm.
barracks, like that is a yieldedness we absolutely have to have. And
Yeah.
it's infinitely qualitatively other than the subjugation of a woman under the headship of the male, or like what we talk about as
Mhm.
submission and yieldedness, right? That's not to be affirmed. That there is
Yeah.
no good version of that, but there
Yeah.
is a good that is a mockery of. And that's what Hillesum discovered. That's what
Mm.
Margaret knew. That's what I think this book is calling us to. So, and there's so many, you sparked me in so many directions at once,
Mm.
but I think that's part of the fire of her life and this story you're telling
Yeah.
is it is pointing to something true that's kind of been lost in the smoke of all the nonsense we've said about eschatology and about submission and about the
Yes.
place of women and mothers and so on. And it's getting through that smoke back to the light.
Yeah. Man, that's so good. And I love you differentiating these sort of different kinds of surrender, because I think where a lot of people now aren't comfortable with any language of surrender, it's still on some level anybody who's ever created anything. I mean, there always has to come a moment of yielding to something outside yourself, something beyond
Yeah.
yourself, something. Um, but to your point, Chris, I want to ask this an earnest question. I'd really love to know what you'd say about this, especially given your context, not only as a bishop and all the things, but as a Pentecostal theologian who's deeply connected with the history of the movement. Because I've been thinking about this on some level for years, and I don't think I've asked anyone about this. So I want to ask you, why do you think it is? Because one of the things that I think is wonderful about our tradition is there's this lively continuity with, well, our God this is the same God of Abraham and Moses,
Yeah.
all the patriarchs and
Yes.
matriarchs. So that same power is available to us. Miracles happen now. The Red Sea could still be parted, like all the things. Why is it that that thing that we see through all of these prophetic figures of being willing to go toe to toe with God, Moses arguing with God over the people, Abraham bartering, and
Mhm.
I go to that a little bit in the book. Why is it that that's never something that's translated per se into the tradition, where anybody's like, well, to walk the path of the prophets, to walk in that same Holy Ghost power, authority, whatever, would also look like that? Why is that not something
Mhm.
that ever seems to be on the table?
Well, yeah, I think it is. It's just there's a there's a difference, I think, between the conventional form of Pentecostal charismatic spirituality
Mm,
and the authentic form. And I
yeah.
think because it's such a populist movement and a popular one, and because it's exploded around the world in the way that it has, the conventional forms are the ones that we know best, because most of the
Mm,
people we know who identify with the movement identify with that conventional form.
yeah.
But I think there's always a minority report, right? And so
Hmm.
if you come at this, and I've written about this, and you and I have discussed it. Like if you look at the history of race and racism as it relates to
Mm,
Pentecostalism, I mean, predominantly that's a horrifying story. You know,
sure.
it's an ugly, grievous story. But there is a minority report. There have
Mm,
always been men and women who have, right from the beginning, at the beginning of the movement, called those sins for what they are, and embodied alternatives that are truer witnesses of what God desires from us.
mm,
And I think the same is true here, that there have been genuine prophets whose lives were intercessory, who were not
mm,
willing to be rescued apart from their people, and so in that sense we're ready to go toe to toe with God.
yeah.
In fact, and again, this is something we've discussed before. This is what I think makes the story of Noah and the story of Job so poignant. is that Noah, when he's told, I'm going to destroy the world and start over, he doesn't argue. And this is why the rabbis will say Noah is the least righteous of all the righteous.
Ooh, wow.
He's righteous, but he's not righteous in the way that Moses and Abraham are, because he doesn't insist, he doesn't intercede, and he doesn't insist on God delivering those who are going to be left out.
Wow.
And in Job's case, you have something similar in that Job repents when he shouldn't. He subjects himself when that's not what's being required. And if I go back to that distinction I made just a moment ago between kind of holy yieldedness, holy submission, and subjugation, which is unholy, God is trying to show him this holy yieldedness. He's trying to awaken in him a kind of submission that opens out on freedom. But Job subjugates himself. So he says at the end, I've heard about you with the ear, now I see you with the eye, and I abhor myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. And what's striking is God doesn't answer. Like if you go and read the book of Job, when Job does this, God doesn't say a thing. Which, try to find another instance in Scripture where someone repents and God doesn't respond.
Wow.
And what happens instead is that God speaks to Job's friends. And what he says to Job's friends is, you have spoken wrongly about me. So go to Job, and he will pray for you. And when he prays for you, I will forgive you. And then Job's life turns. Right? Then there's this sudden blessing. Now, I think part of the way the story is designed to work on us is the temptation would be to think, oh, Job repented, and therefore God gave him all the blessings. But that's what the friends told us would happen. They kept telling Job, you're sinning, and if you stop sinning, God will restore your life.
Yeah.
But Job didn't have anything to repent of. And this is why God doesn't forgive him. God forgives the friends because of Job's intercession. And it's Job's intercession for his friends who've sinned against him that brings him in alignment with the heart of God. So I think we see that same calling on, well, it happens rarely, but that's what we're all called to. It's just, I think many of us, because of the conventional forms of faith, we end up thinking God wants subjugation, and we play the part of repenting instead of the part of intercession. And we end up affirming the friends. We end up with a faith that has a lot more to do with Bildad than it does with Job and the God of Job and the God of Jesus.
That would be a fascinating conversation of itself, is all the repenting that we do, that it's not what God asked for, repentance that God doesn't care about. Oh yeah, well, I wasn't interested in that actually, but
and isn't that another way of playing by a script, right? So just like we think there's an eschatological script, I mean, what are we going to do about? I mean, and the ways in which those scripts make us think about not persons, but abstractions, so that Israel and Palestine become abstractions in our schemes, and we're not thinking about people with names. We're not seeing faces. We're not recognizing the living human beings who are sons and daughters and neighbors and husbands and wives. And that's where the callousness comes in. Is we're dealing with abstractions on a script, and then our repentances are about abstractions, and we're not recognizing our own humanity or the humanity of other people. And this is one of the things I'm convinced of about God. God doesn't even see abstractions. Like, abstractions aren't real to God. Right? But it's not something that when we're talking about abstractions, God doesn't even know what we're talking about. Right? It's not even real for him in any recognizable way. So I think what you're pointing to in the book when you talk about Abraham, his intercession, I mean, that's what it looks like to kind of Abraham is not thinking about Sodom and Gomorrah as abstractions. He's thinking about Lot. He's not thinking about justice in abstraction. He's thinking about, I love some of these people, and they all deserve justice. And that, it should be obvious to us, but it's easy to get clouded about it.
I don't want to detour into this, but it's so alive for me right now. Even when we talk about God not even seeing abstractions, because when Nicole and I had this conversation the other night that for the podcast, towards the very end, she asked me kind of, so where have you been? Like, I know, but sort of like, where have you like the last couple of years in terms of, and it's fascinating in this same idea you talk about Margaret becoming small enough and praying that I would become small. That was one thing she said in your text. I thought about so much about how these last few years of my life, it's sort of been between my family and things they've gone through, and then in the work that's happening here, the people in front of me are all that exist, and some of it I feel like has been schooling that out of me to think in abstractions at all, like kind of just no capacity to do that because what's right here is so present and so immediate, and feeling like that shifted so many things. I do want to ask you, Chris, just a little more broadly, because this is a book about Advent. And, since we've been on this journey together for so long, and everything from coming up where we come from with the same sort of tradition and wonder and baggage and all the stuff, and sort of be on these parallel and then converging paths in terms of, oh, well, we're preaching from the lectionary now, and there's weekly communion, and there's like all the things. It's so interesting to me when I think about it, because another thing I feel like I didn't make until like almost the end was that Margaret was the first person that was an influence for me I heard really talk about Advent, which was not in her tradition per se. I don't know how she ended up every Sunday at her church in Abood preaching through the Advent candles every December, but that's what she did. I mean, it's the Church of God lady from Pell City, Alabama, preaching through the Advent candles in Abood. It's just remarkable the path that she carved out in that way. So I'm just, because I know you've been thinking a lot about Advent in general, and I know a lot of the emphasis in the book is on waiting, but it does have to be about that. I'm curious as to what this is stirring in you now, as we talk about Sister Margaret, as we talk about her way of intercession and like all of that, with how you're experiencing Advent for yourself in the world right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's this shift that I think we all have to undergo. That waiting on God, in some ways, it's all waiting. You say this in the book, right? I mean, that there's a way in which waiting is just what it is to be human. But I think there's a line you can cross at some point in which you realize there's waiting, and then there's waiting the way that God waits. So I can wait on God, or I can learn to wait with God on God, and that's something different, right? And I'm not pretending to be able to do that, but I am starting to sense that that's what I want to do. Right? You know what I mean? Like, I don't think I'm doing it, but I am at least aware that I think it's doable, and I would love to do it. I would love to live the second half of my life and I mean, I'm already well into that second half, I guess, but I'd like to live the second half of my life not just waiting on God, but waiting with God on God. And that sense of tarrying, but not tarrying in the absence of God.
Yeah.
Right. Tarrying being something, our Pentecostal forebears gave us, but not waiting as if God might or might not show up, or waiting as if once God shows up, suddenly life is going to sort itself out. Like the God we're waiting on is already here.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a sense in which God is coming in new ways, and there's the coming of all that is going to make all things right. So, I mean, I don't mean in the sense of kind of endless deferral. I mean, I believe God is coming. God is showing up in all kinds of ways, many times in our lives. But even when God comes, he comes to kind of make a new kind of waiting possible, a new kind of attention. And I do think that's it. I think to wait with God for God is to be attentive differently, and to have and I don't know how to say this, this is more intuitive than anything else. It's somehow to have your longing intensified, but to be more patient too.
Wow.
Right. So like to be your longing is more and more desperate, but you're not restless.
Yeah.
You're not sped up by it.
Mm.
And I think and again, this is what I think we see in the saints, that there's a deep and almost painful longing for God, but it doesn't make them impatient. It doesn't hurry them up. It doesn't make them grasp at things. And I think, again, I'm not living that, but I can see it enough that I want to.
Yeah, it's almost, I've been thinking about so much the way that I feel like so much of my life I'm sort of trying to keep the longing at bay, and how Advent becomes a time in particular to not just welcome it, but to make a home in it. And that being very different from the ways of always trying to outrun it, to outrun longing.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? A couple, actually.
Yeah, please.
So let me put that question back at you. How, now that you've written the books, I mean, we've talked a lot about kind of the movement toward writing it and the process of writing it. Now that it's done, what do you feel like has shifted for you in your awareness? Like and maybe it wasn't about finishing the book, but in this Advent, how has your attention been altered, do you think?
Wow, that's such a great question. I mean, I think one of the things I'm experiencing right now, Chris, is just and I don't want to make too much of this, because just like even Margaret's whole thing of being small enough, not that I feel like the book is the book in and of itself is a big deal, but it feels like a big release for me somehow, in ways like personally, like an internal release. That's something like, maybe it's something of my own sense of resignation to, well, in the same way I reference, Billy Kyles being the guy who was there when King was shot. So then he goes around for 50 years. That's all he talks about, because of course you're inviting
That's what
the
he's
guy
doing.
who was there when Martin Luther King was shot. And like this really, I feel way more in synchronicity when I've fully accepted the fact I really don't have any story to tell except the stories of these handful of people in my life. This is all I got to talk about. And I don't need to think of something else. I don't need to be more creative or clever. Like this is it. There's something about that just feels right. Sort of like Margaret is always kind of at the foreground of my mind, but needs to be out in front of any, with anything that I'm doing. There's a lot of peace in that for me, of feeling like not hiding behind something. But does that make sense at all?
It does. I mean, what it makes me think about in your book is the chapter on Simeon and Anna. And one of the things, just as your friend, I mean, one of the things that I've always loved about you, and I think comes through in your writing and your preaching, because it's in you, is the tenderness you have toward not just Margaret, but people like your elders. I'm thinking now about Ricky Moore as well as Margaret, and I sensed that, and not just Ricky and Margaret, but people who have that, who've gone before you, many of whom nobody else would know. I mean, Ricky and Margaret are somewhat known, but people no one else would know, and the ways in which you're open to them, attentive to them, and I think I sense that reading what you were saying about Simeon and Anna. It's like you recognize they seemed human to you. Again, they weren't types or abstractions. I mean, this is an old man and an old woman finally getting to sigh with relief at the end of their lives, and not just with relief, but with delight. Like God is doing what He promised, and I no kind of grand comment on it. I find that endearing. I love that. And I think I love that about you. And I love that it came through in the book.
Well, and it's such a generous thing to say, but I tell you, Chris, it's because I don't think I was even making this connection with it, because that part I would have written before this experience. But in terms of the way these storylines continue to converge, I've barely talked about publicly at all, just because, again, it's sort of been so much of a season. I feel like I'm living too intensely in the moment to know how to reflect on it, know how to talk about it. But, just about 6 weeks ago, I took on this additional little role here of pastoring Fillmore United Methodist Church, and very rural Indiana, about 15 minutes from here. And there are 50 people or so on Sunday mornings. And Chris, there are only a handful of people in that church that are under 70, like just a handful. And I guess I'm maybe 6 Sundays into this, and I really can't believe just how much, what a gift that experience has been already, because there is something of that Simeon and Anna, that kind of, like this.
Yeah.
This changes whatever. I don't know if I'm accomplishing anything for them or not, but this absolutely changes me, just to kind of be with our people and the all the stories that their faces tell, and being instructed by that. I think that just comes from me out of probably just recognizing a deep need for those kinds of elders and for those kinds of experiences in my life.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. And it's in our world, and I mean the one you and I live in, it's very frequent for those who are aging to be forgotten by their communities. I mean, one of the things, and you and I have discussed this, but one of the things that's really painful for me is to see people who've given their lives to ministry, pastored churches, or led ministries, just get too old to keep doing that, and then they're put out to pasture. You know? And there's something holy about bringing the child Jesus to Simeon and Anna wherever they are, right? And to just show up in the smallest way, in the most unpretentious way possible, to lead communion, preach a sermon, say hello, greet them in the name of the Lord, and hug their necks, right? That kind of, just let me pastor you for just an hour but I'm getting to show you, here's the child Jesus again. And Aaron and Simeon and all of those people again, whose names we won't know, they get to see, right? That, okay, we can depart in peace, because that's, man, I think that's holy, holy, holy work, in part because it's hidden. I mean, this is another thing I'm becoming more and more and more convinced of, that the gap between what we can see and what strikes us as important and what God is actually doing is immeasurable, right? And that what God is actually doing in the world has almost nothing to do with what we can see and what we can measure. In fact, it doesn't have anything to do with it except incidentally, right? That there are ways in which some saints, of course, someone like Martin Luther King, does kind of bring the kingdom of God, if only for a moment, kind of right in our faces, and we have to confront it. Or William Seymour at Azusa Street, or these moments in which suddenly we see it, but it's gone in a flash, right? Bonhoeffer for just a moment, and then it's gone. But most of what God is doing in the world is, it's the seed in the loaf. I mean, the seed in the ground, or it's the yeast in the loaf. And we don't see what's happening. Right. And it's happening in, church filled with 70-year-old people. None of us know. And yet, I say filled, I guess half filled with 70-year-old. I'm coming to not only to recognize that, but to delight in it, like to delight in the humility of a God who doesn't need to be famous. It doesn't need to be seen or noticed. And the people who are like that, who have the kind of ease in their own skin, they don't need to have a persona, and they don't need the limelight. I don't know if we discussed this or not, but this is what hit me recently about the apostle Andrew. He's in the Gospel of John. He's the first apostle called, and as soon as he's called, he and another disciple who's unnamed, perhaps John the Beloved, but whoever it is, the two of them go, and Andrew finds Peter and says, "We have found the Lord," and brings Peter to Jesus. And when he comes to Jesus, Jesus begins to speak to Peter, you're the rock, so on. And I was reading his story. I had to preach a service, and it was on the feast of St. Andrew. And
Mm.
I realized as I was preparing for that, all I know about Andrew is that he's Peter's brother
Mm.
and that he's the first called. And as I sat with it, I realized like this is why Jesus called Andrew. And I found this, and I mean, it's been there all along. I just had never noticed that in the iconographic tradition, Andrew is often shown kind of stepping back and making room for Peter. So he's brought Peter to Jesus, but now he's stepped back and he kind of has his hand open so that Peter can step into the first place
Mm.
and be face to face with Jesus. And it hit me like this is what makes Andrew like Jesus, like the God Jesus reveals.
Wow.
He doesn't need to be in the limelight. Like he can be overshadowed, and he's glad to be, because he knows that it's when you're overshadowed that the Spirit is working in you. Mary was overshadowed and life came into her, and that he didn't need to be in the light. He was glad to step into the shadows so that other people could be in the light. And that's without resentment or without fear, and it's also not just a personality quirk. It's not as if,
Right.
Andrew's just one of those guys who really enjoys being behind the scenes.
Sure. Right.
It's not like he did some kind of spiritual gift inventory or his Enneagram type is, it's just someone who doesn't need, no. It's not about that. It's about the sheer delight in others coming to know the goodness you've seen.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, when you love someone and you experience a song or a film or a meal, something that just turns you.
Yeah.
Of course, you just want them to know that. Like you want them to see it and hear it. And like that kind of comfortability with stepping back and being overshadowed in the best sense. Like I think that's what we all need to learn, right?
Yeah.
We all, and some of us more than others, some of us sooner than others, but all of us need to learn. And I think these, Simeon and Anna have learned that. Joseph learned that. I mean, think about Jesus' stepdad. Like you talk about being overshadowed, right?
Right. Yes.
You've got this young woman you're about to marry. No doubt he had visions for his life that didn't include her suddenly being pregnant with God, didn't include fleeing to Egypt, didn't include raising God, didn't include having to keep his mouth shut about what he knew. And one of the things that it's hit me in the chest over and over and over again over the last few months, is that we don't have a record in the Gospels of Joseph dying. Like there's no time in which we're told, and Joseph died.
Yeah.
And so on happened. And what hit me about it is that he lived with such a light touch, with so much grace, that he could pass without drama.
Wow.
And Jesus could let him pass without drama. Right? That Jesus wasn't there trying to keep his dad alive. Dad, you've got to stay with me. Or Joseph telling himself, I've got to be there for my son. Like that there was an open-handedness to the way that he lived that showed itself in how he died, so that it could happen and we don't even notice that it's happened. And man, something about that is incredibly freeing for me. And it's back to, that's what it means to wait with God.
Yeah.
We got and you introduced me to this, but that the frames, we've got all the time in the world.
Yeah.
That song, right? I mean, if we were doing an altar call, we need that song right now. Right?
I tell you, all the time in the world to get it right. And the way it builds, like it's just, I think about that song still all the time. It's so powerful in that way, because it does. And Howard Watts would talk about that sense of like Christians uniquely sort of have all the time in the world. Like everything doesn't have to be urgent all the time.
That's right. Right. And I think that's what I was trying to name earlier with, there's deep longing, deep passion, and there are urgencies, but they're not driven.
Yeah.
They're not, pulled out ahead of themselves or not sped up out of control. And I think like a kind of fully human life, a life that's kind of worthy of being human, worthy of the grace that it is to be human, is a life that has that urgency. It has intensity. It has desire. It's the zeal of your house has eaten me up, Jesus would say.
Right.
And yet he's never running ahead of himself. Like he's never out of the moment into some imagined future. And in Advent, that's what we're training for, is to have all of that urgency, all of that passion, but not to be sped up, not to get. My grandfather would often say, "Nothing good happens in a hurry. Nothing good happens in a hurry," and like that seems right to me. Right, but that has to be married to the urgency you're talking about, right? Like somehow those things have to hold together.
Chris, I feel like you're probably nobody has embodied more or taught me more about how, we're not telling the stories are telling us. Stuff like that. I've never heard you say that line. It's just a thing I feel like that you do and is in you, that you live. But I kind of, in writing this, some of these things that felt like vignettes, it's so strange because, and I know, again, it's a small work, but even adding the little epilogue at the end and the sort of little reflection on Joseph, because the scene is, it is all about Jesus and it's all about Mary. Joseph is not the one you remember, and connecting that with my own sort of experience to say, and this is the great open secret of the universe. It's really good to be a stepdad. And
that's exactly what I was going to ask you about. Like I wanted to ask, when did that connection happen for you? That connection you make to Joseph. Do you remember? Like, was there a moment in which it clicked? And if so, I want to hear about that.
I don't. That was one of those things, I think, when I was working on the manuscript before, that just felt like it kind of came out of nowhere, but definitely just seems to be more the journey I've been living. And I think that in the same way that I don't know on a surface level, don't really know how to work out all the things we've been talking about surrender and resistance and how does any of that work. And these things you just sort of live into. Because I think it's sort of the nature of my life the last few years has been about being present in these ways and finding that to be enough. Not that everything has to be about getting to some place of emotional equilibrium or like it feeling right to me. But Chris, this is kind of a new experience for me, because while I still have all kind of urgency and heat, hence why hurling this thing out into the world last minute in this kind of manic way, is its own thing. But I keep having these moments. Literally yesterday, when I was driving back from Fillmore, they have a tradition where it was the Sunday where, instead of being in the sanctuary, we meet in the fellowship hall, and the pianist plays, and people call out Christmas hymns they want to sing. And so we sung hymns kind of impromptu for 30, 40 minutes. I gave a little talk. We prayed, like that was it. When I think about most any other experience I've had in ministry, anything vocational, like whatever, how many times you get done with a thing thinking, I wish I'd have done this or that. Here's how this could be better. Next week we'll like whatever. And I noticed that when I was driving home yesterday, the only thing I was thinking was, that was really good. I'm so glad I did that today. Like it was just like the experience being enough. I feel like all of that, I don't know if it's more like a second half of life journey, but all of that's a little new for me. Like kind of having these moments like the Joseph thing and that, where I'm like, oh yeah, that was really good. Like I don't need to improve this. I don't need to do better next week, or, it's just that's not there the same way.
Man, is that enough? That there's my mind is going in so many directions at once, but I do think that, as always, there are paradoxes here. There are opposites that are brought into alignment with each other, but that are forced to coincide by the goodness of God. But I do think that it's there is, back to this point about urgency and desire. There is a way in which we can't be too easily, we shouldn't be too easily satisfied with the way the world is.
Yes.
We have to hunger for justice and righteousness to come. We have to demand, we have to fight like the saints do. Yeah. And yet I think another mark of the holy life is that when we're talking about what other people need, we never say, well, that's just the way the world is, we just have to accept it.
Yes.
We're always fighting for them to have the fullness of justice and peace. But when we're talking about the gifts that are given to us, we're very easy to satisfy. When that gift is just sitting around with 40 gray-haired people singing Christmas hymns. That should be enough for us.
Yeah.
And if it's not, we need to hold that up. Like, why is it not? Why is it not enough? And a lot of that depends on, as you said, like where you are in life. You know, you're not a 20-year-old who's kind of at the beginning of whatever you're going. I mean, you know, you're at a different place in life, and so you can experience it differently. But I want that for myself. I want to be able to never be satisfied on behalf of someone else when they don't have justice.
Yeah.
And just say, well, that's the way the world is. But I do want to be able to say, you know, who my wife and kids are, who my friends are, who I am is enough. That I can have peace with, and to accept every small grace as the grace I need. And again, I'm not doing that well, but I can at least see it and want it. You know, I can at least say, okay, I want to have that kind of. I want to be. George MacDonald has that line about God. He's easy to please and hard to satisfy.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah.
And I think that's what we're naming here. Like you're driving home, you're pleased, right? Because you're not satisfied for all that's happening in the world, but you sense God's pleasure in that, and that was enough.
Well, when you describe that tension and paradox, and Chris, that names it so beautifully, because it is both the whole catalyst behind this book has been it's like a screaming sense of this is not okay. I mean, I go around thinking that all the time in a way, this is not okay. And in this very different way, as you say, when it comes to the gifts that we have personally, it feels like, oh, everything feels like a feast right now. It's like, oh, well, what more could you ask for? And that being, it's just a very interesting place to learn to live.
And I think that's part of, like, the only people we should be trusting to tell us about what's going wrong in the world and how to make it right are the people who are small enough to enjoy the small pleasures of life and be at peace. Like, because the moment we sense that someone's cry for justice is actually a cry for attention.
Yeah.
You know, that they're screaming about this or that, but really what we hear is notice me. Like it loses not just credibility, it loses the force the truth has, right?
Yeah.
It's no longer spirited in the same way.
Yeah.
And I think this, again, the prophets are different from that, right? That we're hearing in their voices not their own ego crying out for attention, but we are hearing the heart of God. And that's, you know, I was just reading today Robert Jensen talking about I've got it right here on the desk. Listen to this. He's talking about, it's a sermon he preached. He's a very young man. I mean, he would have been in his 30s, I think, when he preached this. And it was a Christmas sermon or a Christmas Eve sermon, I think. And he's talking about the people in his parish, or in this parish where he's preaching, kind of raging against the commercialization of Christmas, right? And this is what he says about it. Do not mistake me. We indeed live every act of our lives in the presence of God. But if we find no place in the life of faith for jingle bells, if we sing such joyous things as Britain's ceremony of carols at concerts but not in church, or if we sing the same carol gaily and spontaneously outside a girl's dormitory at midnight and glumly and laboriously in chapel, then we have misunderstood which God we are dealing with. For the real God, before whom we live, the God of Christmas, is not nearly so religious and serious as we are.
Wow.
He does not only enjoy hymns, he likes to relax a little from time to time.
Man.
Like, what's holy about that, right, is that he's confronting that kind of religious self-seriousness that captures us sometimes. And it captures us wherever we fall on the spectrum, socially and politically, like whatever our tradition is. We can start to talk about God in all capital letters and talk about justice. And sometimes we just need to sing jingle bells, right?
Yeah.
And
that's so great.
That kind of deflation of our ego is somehow tied to the opening of our heart to the world. Like that, if my ego isn't the issue, then my heart can be as wide as all things. And but one or the other has to happen, right? Like
Yeah.
like if I'm not humble, I can't truly have a heart for everyone.
Hmm. Man, that's so wonderful, Chris. And I love I'll remember that line that if there's not if there's not space for jingle bells. That's so this is and by the way, this might be landing with a little Pentecostal grandiosity right here. Maybe that's not egoless, but I have to say because this came to me somehow. I think it was when you mentioned kind of in passing something about when you enjoy art or a film or something together. Because I feel like whenever we're together, I feel like it's just furious fun. I mean, just furious fun. I mean, we
Yeah.
just kind of like it's intensely fun. We're both, I think, mad scientists in our own way, and so all the, just the flood of conversation about movies and TV shows and music and theology and all this stuff that like happens. But Chris, I really thought about a few minutes ago for some reason how since I'd been in Tulsa, we met I think around Oklahoma City and we went to go see the Hateful Eight, the
Yes,
Tarantino
that's
movie.
exactly.
And on the way back, I saw a car on fire on the side of the road. I thought maybe somebody's in danger. I pull off. I go down off the interstate, go towards it, like thinking I need to see if everybody's okay. And as I get close to the car, like something out of a movie, the car actually explodes. Just explodes, like literally, like push me back. A few months ago, when we have your amazing ordination service, and we're sitting out at the patio in the gazebo at our friend's house, and we have this wonderful conversation that's very much like that in all these ways. And you just can't make this stuff up. Apparently, a few hours after that, lightning struck the gazebo and it
That's
burnt down. Am I right about this?
Well, it actually it did. It struck through the gazebo and hit the fireplace and exploded that into the house and destroyed that section of the wall. I mean, it was. I mean, there's still. I was just there 6 months or so. I guess have passed. Well, I guess 4 months, and they're still working to repair it. So yeah, it was a serious event.
So I think I'm just wondering, Chris, why it is that whenever we're together, that we seem like there's always such an amazing sense of fun, and yet it also seems like something ends with catching on fire. Like I don't know what that thing is.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing. Everybody, well, nearly everybody that we grew up with, their answer would be, God is trying to stop this, whatever this
Yeah.
is, right? So hopefully it's not that. Hopefully it's not God just barely trying to strike us and just barely missing us.
Yeah, it's that or some sort of sign and wonder. It's like when I had this, there was
Oh, it could be that. Yeah, yeah.
a microburst at my house here in Greencastle, like during a storm a few weeks ago, and 4 trees came down, one on my car, three in the house, and I, walk outside, and nothing happened to any other houses around me. And I'm like, I am the worst person in the world for this to happen to. Like, how many nights that I was awake all night trying to figure out what it meant that I got like a pan pizza, like a personal tornado. Like what have I done now? Just sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that makes me think it's not about me at all. It just keeps happening to you. I just happen to be in the vicinity, which
Right,
is I don't know.
Jonah.
Exactly right.
Exactly. I should have been more nervous about coming to your ordination service to just like I'm just at least nothing caught on fire.
Bring down. Oh my gosh! Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens once we've recorded this. By the time you go public with it, we'll see if there's what's played out. Dear
Any
God,
sort of
help us, I hope.
apocalyptic signs and wonders. Yes.
That's exactly right.
Chris, I'm serious.
Well, man, thank you for the book.
Oh, well, I can't. I was about to say to you, I can't think. I really don't know how to thank you enough. The foreword is so perfect, and both the gift that is, but also the way that you saw Margaret in the book and pushing me like more in that direction. I just now, of course, it feels like such a spirit thing, but at the time it really was like, oh, maybe because I was so squeamish, as busy as you are, like I don't even want to bug Chris with this, but it really felt like the book became something else because of your openness to engage it in this way. So thank you for that, and thank you for the ways that not only you're always illuminating the stories of Scripture, but illuminating the stories of my life in different ways. That's part of what's wonderful about a conversation about this, which I know to expect now. What always happens is I walk away feeling like, oh, now I understand. I now understand what I was doing in my book. Now I understand what's happening in my life, because I feel like that's the kind of clarity that you always bring. And what an extraordinary gift that is.
Yeah, that's kind of you. I do think part of the joy for me in this is to have seen the early version of what you're writing and to be able to recognize it. I mean, it was, oh, this is what's happening here. And then now what you've done, I think is true to that. And I think you'll hear that from people. I think those you probably already are hearing, but more and more as people read it, I think they'll sense that. And the holiness that she bore witness to, and that we all really know we need. I mean, that's the other thing I think about being around saints. You eventually realize, oh, I needed that. That's what I need, whatever that is. And we're desperate for more. God, send us more saints. I like to say about myself that I'm not a saint, but I do believe that I'm essential to making other people saints.
Yeah, I understand.
And I know we need them for sure. God, give us more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like it's just sort of, and even when it brought up Ricky Moore as well, I think it's kind of, I kind of just realized the more we talk about these folks in our lives and the more we tell those stories, how, well, I don't know, just that I really am gravitating to that right now. Like, okay, I may not be a saint, but I have known a handful, and I got to talk about them. I got to talk about their lives, because there is a way that I think people come to know our own saints through us, and vice versa. Just through telling the stories.
It's interesting, and we should probably stop with this because we can go on forever. But I had to write a piece for Ricky's Festschrift. You wrote a piece too, for the collection celebrating his life, and that Robbie and I edited. And I ended up writing about Mary, and it just hit me just now.
Wow.
That both you with Margaret and me with Ricky, like when we went to talk about what they mean to us, it was Mary's story that gave us language for that. I don't think that's an accident either. It just hit me, so I'm not even sure what all to make of it. But that does seem important. Back to what I was saying about mothering.
Yeah, man.
Which,
goodness.
Of course, is not limited to gender roles.
Right. Well, that was what I was going to say, Chris. In the same way that you were talking about before, there is a kind of singularity to the saints, but then there's this way that they sort of all become so one, because while they all have their unique gifts to be certain, how interesting is it that Margaret and like in Ricky Moore, I feel like it's all the same things. The playfulness is there, the mischief is there, the kind of heaviness and lightness is there. There are markers that they very much hold in common.
Oh, absolutely, because it's an integrated life, right? And it's a life that is holding it all together, and therefore all of that stuff is present in unique formulations, of course, but it is all that stuff. It isn't. They wouldn't be saints if some of it was, kept from view or hidden from us.
Yeah,
or from them.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, Chris, thank you so much for this time and for this conversation. Yet another gift I'm grateful for.
Thank you, man. I love you. I'm excited about this book, and I look forward to any chance we get to talk. So thanks for that.
Absolutely. Love you too, friend. It's been special.